They were told they would change the course of history, that their sacrifice would sink entire fleets and save the empire. Young men climbed into cockpits filled with explosives, their final letters written, their fate sealed. The divine wind, they called it, an unstoppable force of human will crashing into American steel. But when the smoke cleared and the ocean settled, the truth emerged like wreckage floating to the surface. Nearly every mission failed. Thousands died, and yet the ships kept coming. How did Japan's most desperate weapon become its most tragic waste? Why did courage alone prove powerless against an enemy that had learned to turn the sky itself into a killing field? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Lieutenant Takeshi Yamada sat in the briefing room on Kyushu Island, his hands folded neatly on his lap, his eyes fixed on the wooden table scarred with cigarette burns and spilled tea. Around him, 19 other pilots waited in similar silence. The air smelled of sweat and incense, a strange mixture of the sacred and the desperate. Outside, mechanics prepared the Yokosuka MXY-7 Oka rockets, small flying bombs with barely enough fuel to reach their targets. These were not aircraft meant for return, they were manned missiles, and everyone in that room knew it. The year was 1945, and Japan was bleeding. Island after island had fallen, Saipan, Iwo Jima, Okinawa hung by a thread. The Imperial Navy, once the pride of the Pacific, had been shattered at Leyte Gulf. Carriers lay gutted on the ocean floor. Experienced pilots were gone, replaced by boys with barely 50 hours of flight training. In the face of annihilation, Japan turned to a doctrine born not from strength, but from desperation. They called it Tokubetsu Kōgekitai, the special attack units. The world would come to know them as Kamikaze. Takeshi was 22 years old. He had been a university student studying literature before the war consumed everything. He wrote poetry, dreamed of teaching, imagined a life filled with books and quiet afternoons. Now he wore a hakimaki headband inscribed with rising sun symbols, and his poetry had become farewell letters sealed in envelopes he would never see opened. His younger brother had already died at Guadalcanal. His father had perished when the transport ship he served on was torpedoed off the coast of the Philippines. Takeshi was the last son, and yet here he was, volunteering for a mission with no return. The briefing officer entered, a gaunt commander named Fujita, whose eyes carried the exhaustion of a man who had sent hundreds of young men to their deaths. He unrolled a map on the table, and the pilots leaned forward. The target was a formation of American destroyers and escort carriers operating near Okinawa. Intelligence reported minimal air cover, a window of opportunity. Fujita's voice was steady, almost rehearsed, as he described the honor awaiting them, the glory of striking back against the invaders, the immortality their sacrifice would earn. But Takeshi noticed what Fujita did not say. He did not mention the survival rate. He did not speak of the pilots who had flown similar missions and simply vanished, their bombs exploding harmlessly in the ocean, or their planes disintegrating before reaching their targets. He did not acknowledge the bitter truth whispered among the remaining veteran pilots, that for all the ceremony and all the courage, the kamikaze missions were failing. Not occasionally, not sometimes, almost always. The doctrine had seemed inevitable, even logical, in its inception. Japan's resources were exhausted, fuel was scarce, pilots took months to train properly, and Japan no longer had months. Conventional bombing runs required skilled aviators who could strike, evade, and return to fight another day. But what if return was never the goal? What if the plane itself became the weapon, guided by human determination into the heart of an enemy ship? One man, one plane, one explosion. The arithmetic seemed cruel but efficient. Admiral Takejiro Onishi, architect of the kamikaze strategy, had framed it as the ultimate expression of Bushido, the samurai code: death before dishonor. Sacrifice for the emperor. A pilot willing to die could, in theory, accomplish what 10 ordinary pilots could not. The Americans feared nothing more than a man who had already accepted death, Onishi had said, and for a brief flickering moment, it seemed he might be right. The first organized kamikaze attacks, launched in October 1944 during the Battle of Leyte Gulf. Mitsubishi, A6M0s, their bellies packed with explosives, doves screaming toward a Kamikaze escort carrier USS St. Louis took a direct hit, erupting in flames and sinking within minutes. Other ships were damaged, their crews shocked by the ferocity of men willing to die just to wound them. Across the Pacific, the attacks sent ripples of fear. American sailors began to dread the sight of a lone aircraft approaching at strange angles, the knowledge that the pilot intended not to drop a bomb but to become one. For a moment, Japan believed it had found a weapon that could turn the tide. Propaganda films glorified the kamikaze as divine warriors, their spirits ascending to Yasukuni Shrine, their names immortalized. Families received letters from their sons written hours before death, letters filled with poetry and devotion. The emperor himself praised their sacrifice. Young men lined up to volunteer, driven by a mixture of patriotism, duty, and the crushing weight of a culture that equated survival with shame. Takeshi remembered the day he volunteered. It had not felt like a choice. His commanding officer had gathered the remaining pilots and asked who would step forward for the special attack units. The room had been silent for a long, terrible moment. Then one pilot stood, then another. Takeshi felt the eyes of his comrades on him, felt the ghost of his father's expectation, felt the pull of a narrative that had been written into his bones since childhood. He stood. His hands did not shake, his voice did not waver. He said the words expected of him, and in that moment his future ended. But now, sitting in the briefing room, staring at the map with its neat red circles marking targets, Takeshi felt something else stirring beneath the surface of his resolve. Doubt, not in his willingness to die, that much had been decided, but doubt in whether his death would mean anything at all. He had heard the rumors. Pilots who had flown out and never been seen again, their planes lost without a single confirmed hit, missions that returned with only a handful of survivors, their bombs dropped uselessly into the sea, when American fighters tore them apart before they could reach the targets. The mathematics of sacrifice only worked if the sacrifice accomplished something, and increasingly, it did not. The Americans had changed. In the early days of the kamikaze, their defenses had been unprepared, their ships vulnerable, but by early 1945, the U.S. Navy had transformed itself into a machine designed for one purpose: to kill kamikaze pilots before they could kill Americans. Every lesson learned from the first waves of suicide attacks had been absorbed, analyzed and weaponized. The divine wind was about to collide with a wall of steel and radar, and the wind would break. Takeshi did not know the specifics, but he could feel it in the way the briefings had grown vaguer, the way fewer pilots returned from reconnaissance missions, the way the mechanics worked with a grim fatalism that suggested they knew the planes they prepared were coffins. Something had shifted. The enemy had adapted, and Japan's desperation was about to meet America's innovation in the cold algebra of modern war. Commander Fujita finished his briefing and stepped back. The pilots rose, bowing in unison. Tomorrow at dawn, they would fly. Takeshi walked out into the humid night air, the sound of cicadas filling the darkness. Above him, stars scattered across the sky, indifferent and eternal. He thought of his mother, waiting in a village near Hiroshima, unaware that her last son had already written his final letter. He thought of the poems he would never finish, the life he would never live, and he thought, with a clarity that surprised him, that he was about to die for a strategy that had already failed, but he would fly anyway, because the code demanded it, because the culture demanded it, because turning back now would mean dishonor worse than death. Takeshi Yamada, poet and student, had become a weapon, and tomorrow, the sky would decide whether that weapon would find its mark or simply disappear into the vastness of the Pacific. One more young man lost to a war that had already been decided. The doctrine of the kamikaze was built on a foundation of myth and desperation. Japan had entered the war believing in the superiority of spirit over matter, that discipline and willingness to sacrifice could overcome material disadvantage. The samurai tradition, centuries old, had glorified death and service to one's lord. The kamikaze pilots were told they were the spiritual descendants of those warriors, that their courage would inspire the nation and shatter the resolve of the enemy. Every attack, they were assured, would sink a ship. Every death would bring Japan closer to negotiating an honorable peace. But myths require ignorance to survive, and by 1945, the reality of modern naval warfare had rendered the romantic notions of the kamikaze obsolete. Before the first pilot ever took off, the Americans were not an enemy that could be frightened into submission. They were an industrial colossus with resources that dwarfed Japan's, and they had spent the year since Pearl Harbor learning, adapting, and building weapons specifically designed to counter every threat the Japanese could muster. The Japanese High Command had made a fatal miscalculation. They assumed that American morale was fragile, that a democracy built on individualism could not withstand the psychological horror of men willingly dying to kill them. They believed that after enough kamikaze strikes, after enough ships burned and enough sailors died, the American public would demand withdrawal. The strategy was not purely military, it was psychological warfare aimed at the home front. Break the will of the enemy, and victory would follow. But the architects of the Kamikaze had misunderstood their opponent entirely. The attacks did not break America. They hardened it.
Preparing and narrating the story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Every suicide plane that crashed into a carrier, every sailor burned alive by aviation fuel, every young American killed by a pilot who chose death, it all fed a rage that demanded not retreat but total annihilation of the enemy. The Kamikaze did not inspire fear that led to surrender. It inspired hatred that led to Hiroshima. The aircraft themselves were born from scarcity. The Mitsubishi S6-0, once the pride of Japanese aviation, had been designed for agility and range, not for survival. Its lightweight frame made it nimble but fragile. A single burst from American machine guns could shred its wings. It carried no armor plating to protect the pilot, no self-sealing fuel tanks to prevent fires. In the hands of a skilled aviator, it was deadly. In the hands of a barely trained kamikaze pilot, it was a flying coffin. As the war dragged on and resources dwindled, Japan turned to even more desperate measures. The Yokosuka MXY-7 Oka, the aircraft Takeshi would fly, was not truly an aircraft at all. It was a rocket-powered bomb with a cockpit. The pilot had no engine controls, no landing gear, no possibility of return. It was carried beneath a bomber until close to the target, then released. The pilot would ignite the rockets, accelerating to over 600 miles per hour, and aim for an enemy ship. In theory, the speed made it nearly impossible to intercept. In practice, the bombers carrying the Oka were slow, vulnerable, and almost always shot down before they could release their payload. The men who flew these machines came from across Japanese society. Some were seasoned pilots reassigned to the special attack units, men who understood exactly what they were being asked to do and chose it anyway out of loyalty or fatalism. But most were young, some as young as 17, pulled from universities and technical schools with minimal flight training. They could take off and fly in a straight line. Many could not land even if they wanted to. They were taught just enough to aim their planes at a ship and die. Takeshi had received 60 hours of flight instruction. He had never engaged in combat. He had never fired his guns at an enemy aircraft. He had practiced diving angles and studied silhouettes of American ships, learning to distinguish a destroyer from a cruiser from a carrier, but he had never flown at night, never navigated through clouds, never experienced the disorientation of combat when tracers filled the sky and explosions rocked his plane. He was in every practical sense a novice being asked to execute a mission that would challenge even veterans. And yet the mythology persisted. The kami, the divine spirits, would guide them. Their purity of purpose would transcend their lack of skill. The Americans, it was said, were soft, reliant on machines, lacking the spiritual strength that defined the Japanese warrior. These were the lies that filled the final briefings, the comforting fictions that allowed young men to climb into their cockpits without collapsing under the weight of terror. Takeshi wanted to believe. He recited the slogans, wore the symbols, wrote the expected words in his farewell letter. But late at night, when the other pilots had fallen into restless sleep, he lay awake and wondered. He wondered if the commanders truly believed the propaganda they repeated, or if they simply needed the pilots to believe long enough to take off. He wondered if his death would be recorded accurately, if his family would be told he struck a mighty blow, or if he would simply vanish into the statistics of a losing war. He wondered if there was honor in dying for a strategy everyone quietly knew was failing. The morning of the mission arrived with a gray dawn, the sun hidden behind layers of cloud. Takeshi ate a ritual breakfast of rice and pickled vegetables, the same meal samurai had eaten before battle centuries ago. The other pilots around him were silent, their faces pale, their movements slow and deliberate as though they were already ghosts. Some wrote last-minute additions to their letters. Others simply stared into the distance, retreating into whatever private thoughts sustained them. The Oka rocket was loaded beneath a Mitsubishi G4M bomber, a lumbering twin-engine aircraft the Americans called the Flying Lighter because of how easily it caught fire. Takeshi climbed into the cramped cockpit of the Oka, his body squeezed into a space barely large enough to sit. There were no instruments beyond a basic altimeter and airspeed indicator. The controls were minimal. This was not a machine meant to be flown, it was meant to be aimed. The bomber's engines coughed to life, and the formation began to taxi toward the runway. Takeshi could see other bombers ahead, each carrying their own Oka, each pilot sealed inside waiting for release. The formation would fly low over the ocean, attempting to avoid radar detection,
then climb at the last moment to release the rocket bombs. The pilots would ignite their engines and plunge toward the American fleet. It was a simple plan. It had to be simple because the pilots were not skilled enough for complexity. As the bomber lifted off and climbed into the clouds, Takeshi felt a strange calm settle over him. The decision had been made. There was no turning back now. The fear that had gnawed at him for days dissolved into something else, a kind of numbness, an acceptance. He thought of his father, somewhere at the bottom of the Philippine Sea. He thought of his brother, buried in the jungle mud of Guadalcanal. He thought of his mother, who would receive a letter from the emperor, thanking her for her son's sacrifice. And he thought, with the clarity that comes in final moments, that none of this should have been necessary. But necessity was no longer the question. The machinery of war had been set in motion, and Takeshi Yamada was now just another component in a strategy built on the bodies of young men who believed they had no choice. The bomber droned on through the gray sky, carrying him toward a fate that had been written the moment he stood and volunteered. The divine wind was about to blow and the Americans were waiting. The formation flew for 90 minutes before the radio crackled with the first warning. American radar had detected them. The element of surprise, already thin, evaporated entirely. Takeshi felt the bomber beneath him shift, the pilot attempting evasive maneuvers that only made the lumbering aircraft more vulnerable. Through the small window of his Oka cockpit he could see the ocean far below, a vast expanse of gray water broken by whitecaps. Somewhere in that emptiness the American fleet waited. What Takeshi did not know, what none of the kamikaze pilots could know, was that the ocean was no longer empty. The Americans had transformed the sea around their fleet into a killing zone engineered with brutal precision. The defensive system began not at the ships themselves but miles away, in concentric rings of detection and destruction designed to eliminate threats long before they became dangerous. The kamikaze were not flying into battle, they were flying into a machine. The outermost ring consisted of radar picket destroyers, solitary warships positioned 30 to 50 miles from the main fleet. These destroyers carried the most advanced radar systems available, capable of detecting aircraft at extreme ranges. Their sole purpose was to serve as an early warning network, identifying incoming threats and vectoring fighter aircraft to intercept. The picket ships were death traps, isolated and exposed, and their crews knew it. Many were hit by kamikaze attacks, but their sacrifice bought time, and time was the first line of defense. On this morning, the destroyer USS Hazelwood detected the incoming formation at 42 miles. Within seconds, the information flashed to the fleet command and the machine activated. Combat air patrol fighters, Grumman F-6F Hellcats already airborne and circling at altitude, received vectors to intercept. The Japanese bombers, slow and ungainly, had just been marked for death. Takeshi heard the bomber's engines roar as the pilot pushed for speed, a futile gesture. The G4M could manage perhaps 270 miles per hour at best, and it was carrying a heavy load. The Hellcats dove from above at over 400 miles per hour, 650 caliber machine guns in each aircraft capable of firing 4,800 rounds per minute combined. The math was simple and merciless. The bombers did not stand a chance. The first Hellcat opened fire at 800 yards. Tracers laced through the air, glowing lines of death that converged on the lead bomber. The aircraft shuddered, pieces of its wing tearing away. It dipped, struggled to maintain altitude, then nosed over and plummeted into the sea. The pilot of Takeshi's bomber threw the plane into a desperate turn, but the Hellcats were everywhere now, circling like sharks, taking turns to attack. Another bomber erupted in flames, its fuel tanks igniting instantly. The crew had no time to scream. It simply became a falling torch. Inside the Oka, Takeshi was helpless. He could not see the fighters. He could only feel the bomber shaking, hear the rattle of machine gun fire chewing through aluminum, smell the acrid smoke seeping into his tiny cockpit. His hands gripped the control stick, but he had no control. The bomber pilot's voice came over the intercom, frantic and broken. "We are releasing. Prepare for drop." It was too early. They were nowhere near the target. But the bomber was dying and the pilot had no choice. Takeshi felt the clamps release, felt the sudden sickening drop as the Oka separated from the bomber. He was falling, nose down, the ocean rushing up toward him. He ignited the rockets. The acceleration slammed him back into his seat, the world blurring into a tunnel of speed and noise. He was moving at 600 miles per hour now, a guided missile hurtling toward nothing. He could see ships in the distance, small gray shapes on the horizon. He aimed for the nearest one, a destroyer, pulling the control stick to adjust his angle. But he was diving too steeply, the speed too great. The Oka was not designed for precision. It was designed to crash. He pulled harder, felt the frame groaning under the stress, and then he saw them. Tracers. Hundreds of them, thousands, rising from the ships in a curtain of fire so dense it seemed impossible to pass through. The second ring of defense had activated. Every ship in the fleet had been equipped with vastly upgraded anti-aircraft weaponry. The 40 Bofors guns fired explosive shells at a rate of 120 rounds per minute per gun, and most ships carried dozens of them. The 20 Ophir-Lycon cannons spat out 450 rounds per minute, filling the air with a wall of lead. But the most revolutionary weapon was the proximity fuse, a technological marvel that had turned anti-aircraft fire from a game of chance into a science of slaughter. Traditional anti-aircraft shells required direct hits or precise timing to detonate at the right altitude. Proximity fuses use miniature radar transceivers inside each shell. When the shell passed within 70 feet of an aircraft, it detonated automatically, sending shrapnel ripping through the target. The Kamikaze pilots flew into clouds of exploding metal that required no accuracy from the gunners, only volume, and volume the Americans had in endless supply. Takeshi's Oka entered the fire zone traveling at terminal velocity. A proximity shell detonated 30 feet to his left. Shrapnel punched through the thin skin of the rocket, shredding control surfaces. The Oka yawed violently, spinning. Another explosion, closer this time, and Takeshi felt something tear through his left arm, a white-hot spike of pain. Blood sprayed across the inside of the cockpit. The instrument shattered. He could no longer see, could no longer steer, could only hold on as the machine disintegrated around him. The destroyer he had been aiming for never even maneuvered. It did not need to. The Oka, trailing smoke and flames, missed the ship by 200 yards and slammed into the ocean at 550 miles per hour. The impact was instantaneous. Metal crumpled. Explosives detonated. Water rushed in. Lieutenant Takeshi Yamada ceased to exist, his body vaporized in the collision, his final thought lost in the roar of his own failure. He was not alone. Of the 12 bombers that had launched that morning, 11 were shot down by combat air patrol fighters before they could release their Oka rockets. The 12th, Takeshi's, managed to release its payload only to watch it destroyed by anti-aircraft fire. Not a single American ship was hit. Not a single American sailor died. 12 bombers, 12 Oka pilots, and dozens of crew members were gone. For nothing. This was not an anomaly. It was the pattern. By the time the kamikaze strategy reached its peak in the spring of 1945 during the Battle of Okinawa, the Americans had refined their defensive system to near perfection. Statistical analysis showed that fewer than 10% of kamikaze aircraft ever reached their targets. Of those that did, fewer than half caused significant damage. The success rate, if it could be called that, was abysmal. For every ship sunk, Japan lost dozens of aircraft and pilots. The mathematics of attrition had turned against the divine wind. The reasons for failure were systematic and overwhelming. First, the quality of pilots had collapsed. By 1945, Japan was sending men into the air with less training than it took to qualify for a civilian pilot's license. They could not navigate properly, could not judge distances, could not compensate for wind or flak. Many never even found the American fleet. They flew until they ran out of fuel and crashed into the empty ocean, their deaths unrecorded, their sacrifice invisible. Second, the aircraft themselves were obsolete and fragile. The Zero, once feared, was now understood and countered. American pilots had learned to avoid dogfights where the Zero's agility mattered. Instead, they used hit-and-run tactics, diving from above with superior speed and firepower, shredding the unarmored Japanese planes before they could react. The Hellcat had a kill ratio of 19-1 against Japanese aircraft. The kamikaze pilots were not warriors meeting equals in honorable combat, they were prey. Third, the American defenses had become layered and redundant. Even if a kamikaze evaded the combat air patrol, even if it survived the first barrage of anti-aircraft fire, there were always more guns, more ships, more layers. The fleet formations used interlocking fields of fire, so that every approach angle was covered. Smoke screens obscured decoy ships drew attacks away from valuable radio jamming disrupted Japanese communications. Every technological advantage America possessed was deployed, and Japan had no counter. Fourth, and perhaps most devastating, was the psychological toll on the defenders. The kamikaze attacks did not break America, they forged it into something harder. Every sailor who survived an attack became more determined, more efficient, more ruthless. Gunners learned to lead their targets with cold precision. Fighter pilots hunted kamikaze formations with professional detachment. The horror of watching men deliberately crash into ships did not inspire fear. It inspired a grim resolve to kill every single attacker before they could reach their target. The divine wind met industrial fury, and fury won. Admiral Matome Ugaki, who took over the kamikaze operations after Admiral Onishi, kept meticulous records. The numbers were damning. In April 1945 alone, over 1,500 kamikaze sorties were launched during the Okinawa campaign. Fewer than 15% achieved any contact with enemy ships. Of those, only a fraction caused serious damage. The Americans lost ships, yes. The destroyer USS Laffey survived being hit by 6 kamikaze aircraft in 80 minutes and remained afloat, a testament to American damage control and engineering. For every ship Japan damaged or sank, it lost irreplaceable aircraft and pilots. The strategic failure was even more profound. The kamikaze were supposed to buy time to inflict such losses that America would negotiate rather than invade the home islands. Instead, they accelerated the American decision to use atomic weapons. The kamikaze convinced U.S. military planners that Japan would never surrender, that every inch of Japanese soil would be defended with fanatical determination. The suicide attacks did not demonstrate strength. They demonstrated that Japan was willing to destroy itself rather than admit defeat. And so America chose to end the war with overwhelming absolute force. In the final months, the kamikaze missions became increasingly desperate. Pilots flew in ancient biplanes, in trainers never meant for combat, in anything that could carry a bomb. Some missions launched at night despite the pilots having no night flying experience. They crashed into the sea trying to find targets they could not see. Others were sent out knowing there was not enough fuel to return even if they changed their minds. The machinery of sacrifice ground on, consuming young men until there were none left to send. Lieutenant Takeshi Yamada's death was recorded in a ledger at the Kanoya Air Base. His mother received a letter from the military informing her that her son had struck a powerful blow against the enemy and died a hero. The letter was a lie. His sacrifice had achieved nothing. The destroyer he aimed for continued its patrol. The American fleet sailed on, the war ground toward its inevitable conclusion. The kamikaze mythology persisted long after the war, romanticized in films and literature as the ultimate expression of loyalty and courage. But the men who flew those missions, the men who died in them, deserved more than mythology. They deserved the truth. The truth was that they were poorly trained pilots in obsolete aircraft, sent on missions with no realistic chance of success, by commanders who knew the strategy was failing but continued anyway because to stop would be to admit defeat. The divine wind did not fail because the pilots lacked courage. It failed because courage alone cannot overcome radar, proximity fuses, overwhelming firepower, and an enemy with unlimited resources. It failed because Japan confused desperation with strategy, because it sacrificed its young men to a doctrine that valued symbolic gestures over tactical reality. It failed because modern war is not decided by the spirit of warriors but by the capacity of industries, the quality of technology, and the cold logic of attrition. By the time Japan surrendered in August 1945, nearly 4,000 kamikaze pilots had died. They sank or damaged several dozen American ships, killed several thousand sailors, and ultimately changed nothing. The American fleet continued to advance, the blockade tightened, the bombers came. The war ended not because of kamikaze attacks but despite them, it ended in atomic fire that rendered all previous sacrifice meaningless. Today the kamikaze are remembered as tragic figures, young men caught in the machinery of a war that had already been lost. Their letters, preserved in museums, speak of duty and resignation more than fanaticism. They wrote of cherry blossoms and mothers, of small regrets and quiet hopes that their deaths would mean something. Takeshi Yamada's letter, if it still exists somewhere in a military archive, would likely read much the same. A young man trying to find meaning in a meaningless death. The failure of the kamikaze was not a failure of the men who flew. It was a failure of the leaders who sent them, a failure of a culture that could not distinguish between honor and waste, a failure of a nation that chose beautiful lies over hard truths. The divine wind was never divine. It was desperation dressed in ceremony, and when it met the cold efficiency of American naval warfare, it simply blew itself out, leaving nothing behind but wreckage and grief. The ocean keeps its secrets. Somewhere off the coast of Okinawa, in water too deep to dive, the shattered remains of an Oka rocket rest on the seabed. No one knows it is there, no one remembers the man who died inside it. The war moved on, history moved on, and the sacrifice became just another statistic in a campaign built on statistics. Lieutenant Takeshi Yamada, poet and student, became a number in a ledger. His death changed nothing, and that more than the manner of his death was the true tragedy of the kamikaze. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.